Wow. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the House Government, Labor, and Elections Committee. I'm Delegate Wells, joined by my Vice Chair, Delegate Kerr, and today we have a fiscal briefing from DLS. So with that, I will give you the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. David Romans from Legislative Services. I'm joined with Mary Beth Brisky, who's going to keep me on the right page in the document. So we have a very voluminous document about overview of the budget. I'm just going to talk to you about the first 10 pages or so, just give you the overview, and then to the extent you have time, happy to answer any questions that members have. So on that first page, you can see at the top of the page, there's about $70.7 billion in the proposed fiscal 27 budget. It's about a $505 million increase over the current year's budget. It is worth noting the current year's budget is $3 billion bigger than what you passed last session because the governor is proposing deficiency appropriations to cover shortfalls in various programs, primarily in the health department. General funds and federal funds actually declined very slightly. There's a big increase in special funds because there's more transportation trust fund spending and more blueprint spending. Some key points about the budget. The governor leaves a fund balance at the end of fiscal 27 of about $110 million. He has a rainy day fund balance of about $2.2 billion, 8% of general fund revenues, which was the Spending Affordability Committee's goal for the governor. The governor also made some progress in reducing what we call the structural deficit, which is comparing ongoing revenues to ongoing spending. Back in December, the forecast was for about a $1.2 billion shortfall. The governor closed that for fiscal 27 to about $400 million, which surpassed the Spending Affordability Committee goal of cutting it in half to about $600 million. If we go to page 2, so what this page highlights is that the governor's balancing plan relies on the Budget Reconciliation Financing Act, a separate bill, to balance the budget. The Budget Reconciliation Financing Act includes $1.5 billion of balancing actions. Without it, you would be out of balance by $1.4 billion. So it's a very important bill. And the actions in the Budget Reconciliation Act are sort of broken into revenues, transfers, and spending on this slide. I'll just mention a few in each category. Under the revenue category, the biggest item is $150 million being transferred from the local income tax reserve account. This account had received an overallocation from the state in fiscal 25. This is just correcting for the overallocation. The maybe most noticeable from a policy, or notable from a policy perspective, is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that Congress passed included a number of business tax provisions. And many of those flow through, but the business takes the deduction on their federal taxes, and then it flows through to the Maryland taxes. So the state has the option of decoupling, separating from those changes. The governor is proposing to fully decouple from one of the changes related to depreciation of production property, and to partially decouple from a second provision. So I'll mention later on, there are two other provisions in the federal bill that the governor is proposing to go along with, not to decouple from. So he sort of picked and chose which ones should flow through to Maryland law. Under transfers, the most notable is about $259 million from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, which had, coming into the year, had a surplus of around $1 billion. So the governor is sending part of it to the general fund to help balance the budget. A couple of lines down under transfers, the Bay Restoration Fund has $70 million transferred to the general fund. The good news for those of you who like the programs funded with the Bay Restoration Fund is the governor is fully backfilling those dollars with bonds. So there will still be the same level of activity, it's just funded with bonds instead of cash. Under spending reductions, the largest item is a $450 million reduction by not putting any new money into the rainy day fund. The state law mandates the governor to put about $450 million in. Because he already has $2.2 billion in the rainy day fund, the governor doesn't think it's necessary to put this additional $450 million in. So that's helps balance the budget by not having to put it into the savings account. There's a couple of local aid reductions that I just want to highlight for you. One is related to teachers' retirement, librarian retirement, community college retirement. The governor is proposing to share the growth in the state's costs with local governments. He's basically shifting $39 million of costs to the county governments. rather than the state paying those retirement costs. So these will be costs borne by the county government itself, not the LEA or the community college, but by the county government. So $39 million across the state. Second local aid cut of note relates to the disparity grant. The disparity grant is under the governor's plan is level funded at the 2026 formula level. That saves the state $27 million as the formula would have grown. It has a big impact on 2 counties. Prince George's County would receive $17.5 million less than if the formula was fully funded, and Allegheny County receives about $6 million less. There's also smaller dollar impacts on a number of counties on the Eastern Shore, as well as Garrett County. The final local aid item I wanted to highlight relates to community college formula. The governor saves $21 million by capping the growth for each individual community college at 3%. So there is overall growth in the formula. It goes up by 11 million across the state, but it would have grown by 32 million, but the governor's capping each individual college at this 3% growth. And he proposes to do that for 3 years. So each of the next couple of years, again, the growth would be capped at 3% for each college. So those are the major, I think, items of interest on the cuts. We go to the next slide. So we turn here to looking at the structural budget outlook for not just fiscal 27, but for the next term. The bars show you the governor's forecast based on his budget plan. The dotted line was the legislative services forecast back in December when we briefed the Spending Affordability Committee. You can see the governor made a lot of progress in fiscal 27, and he made some progress in fiscal 28. But by his own scoring, the outlook for most of the next term remains fairly bleak, getting to about a $4 billion shortfall by 2031. So while this year's budget may not be especially difficult to balance, I think in the next term you're going to face some very significant challenges in trying to better align revenues and ongoing spending. We can go to the next slide. So I turn to the next couple of slides to talking about how did the governor balance this budget. So back in December, when we were forecasting about a $1.6 billion cash shortfall, and what this pie chart shows is that about 3/4 of the solution was spending reductions versus what was expected to be spent in our forecast. And the next slide shows you the areas where there's more spending than expected and less spending than we were expecting back in December. The biggest area of decrease is the Budget Reconciliation Act items that I talked about. There's about $600 million of savings. There's about $345 million of savings that are simply finding federal funds or special funds to substitute for general funds. So no cut to a program, just finding a different way to pay for it. But there are a couple of those decreases that I want to highlight for you because they're more notable. One is in the behavioral health Medicaid area. There's about $170 million less than we were expecting. And there's not really cost containment going on there. So we're concerned that the governor has underfunded the Medicaid behavioral health budget by a substantial amount. And that is something we will dig into more as we work through the details of the budget with the Appropriations Committee. Second area to call your attention to is developmental disabilities. The governor is actually proposing $150 million of general fund cost containment there. Those costs are matched by federal dollars, so it's really $300 million of savings in the developmental disabilities budget. Many of the cost containment items are similar to things the governor proposed last session, some of which were rejected entirely by the General Assembly last year. So that is an area where, I think the Appropriations Committee will spend a lot of time digging into that and understanding what the governor has done. One other thing I would notice in terms of provider rate increases, so this is for both developmental disabilities, behavioral health providers, Medicaid providers, non-public placements, foster care providers, all those different community-based providers. There's no rate increase for them this year. However, in a bit of a departure from the past, there is a 1.5% cost of living increase for state employees. Usually we've seen not necessarily the same level of increase for state employees and providers, but similar. They move in the same direction, and so this is a little bit of a departure from that, with the state employees getting a modest increase and the providers not. On the far right part of the chart, you can see there's a big increase, nearly $260 million, which we're calling sort of enhancements initiatives. These are discretionary decisions that the governor made of things to fund in the budget, and they're highlighted on the next slide. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll let you all look at these. at your leisure for the most part. There's not necessarily a theme, although there's a fair number of economic development related items. A couple of things I will highlight. There's a $30 million placeholder, if you will, for legislative priorities. So as you know, the General Assembly can add to the budget, but it can't spend more than the governor proposed. So he's basically put a placeholder in of 30 million so you can cut that 30 million and add legislative priorities to the budget. This is the first time the governor's actually left a placeholder for the General Assembly in the operating budget. I would also note the Sunny Day Fund gets 16 million of new money. This is a fund that's available to the governor to help attract businesses to the state or help retain a business that's threatening to move out of state. There was also 16 million put into the budget last year. None of that has been used, so if this level of funding is approved, there'll be 32 million available for those kind of business attraction activities. One last item I'll mention, there's about 15 million for AstraZeneca facilities. The governor announced back in November that AstraZeneca had agreed to expand a facility in Frederick and open a new facility, build a new facility in Gaithersburg, and that the state agreed to pay about $14.5 million a year for 8 years to help subsidize their costs of the construction. Again, there's a lot of items there. I'll let you all take a look at that at your leisure. If we go to the next slide. I wanted to pay a little bit of attention here in that chart at the top of this slide at the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, as this is one of the more interesting portions of the budget. As I mentioned, we had a large surplus coming into the fiscal year. This is because we've seen a big surge in revenues to the Strategic Energy Investment Fund over the last couple of years. So what the governor is doing is he's proposing to use about 333 million of that surplus to help with the budget. So he transfers a total of 292 million to the general fund. He uses 30 million to fund capital projects that have a purpose that's related to the Strategic Energy Investment Fund's goals. And then he identified about 11 million of costs in various state agencies that he thought could be, were eligible for CEF funding. So he's using CEF in place of general funds. So he gets 333 million of budget relief, if you will, from using CEF. And then there's nearly 400 million of sort of new investments. A couple to note, as you may recall last session, the General Assembly provided 200 million to provide rate relief to all the ratepayers in the state. That was doled out, I believe, in 2 tranches of $40 per person or per customer. The governor is proposing 100 million to provide one $40 discount on bills in fiscal 27. He also has $100 million to provide financial incentives for solar and clean energy projects that have been harmed by federal cuts to the incentives that the federal government was providing for those sort of projects. Last thing I'll mention on the list is there's 42 million to go to higher education research centers to do energy resiliency and climate research. About 25 million of this would go to the University System of Maryland, 8.5 to Morgan State, and 8.5 to Johns Hopkins. But it seems to be a one-time investment in research, so there's a little bit of lack of detail on what exactly that's going to support. And then there's a lot of more traditional uses of CEF, just putting more money into renewables and clean energy and so forth. The first bullet under there talks about K through 12 education. The governor's budget increases K through 12 education spending by $359 million, or about 4%. Notable in that is there's 228 million of discretionary growth. There are schools that are community eligibility provision schools, and under prior state law, there was a hold harmless that maintained a certain number. Their counts of students who were eligible for free and reduced price meals had sort of a floor that they couldn't fall below. That state provision in state law sunsetted at the end of fiscal 26, and as a result, we were going to see about a 33,000 drop in the number of students qualifying as free and reduced priced meals. The governor is saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have sunsetted. Let's restore that hold harmless provision for those community eligibility provision schools. So by adding those 33,000 students back to the enrollment counts, there's another 228 million that flows through the education formulas. That particularly benefits Baltimore City, Prince George's County, and Montgomery County, but a number of other jurisdictions also benefit from that. It really depends on how many schools in your county were community eligibility provision schools. I think that's all for that slide, and I think we can actually skip the next slide and go to slide 9. I just want to highlight some of the key fiscal issues for the session and perhaps in some cases for the next term. Obviously, the long-term sustainability of the budget is the major overarching issue. I think is probably going to be dealt with in the next term, but that's the biggest challenge. Related to that is the continuing concern about whether there'll be more federal actions that adversely impact either our economy through workforce cuts or the state budget and local government budgets by cuts to federal grants and so forth. So that's just something that could alter our outlook if there's another round of federal spending reductions. Another issue is obviously I mentioned before this decoupling issue. Which of the federal tax changes in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act does the state go along with, and which ones do we decouple from? I highlight in those little sub-bullets the places where the governor is proposing to go along with the Congress's actions, the most notable being to provide a deduction for research and experimental expenditures. If the state were to decouple from that, we would actually generate over $100 million, but the governor prefers to let that deduction go to the businesses. Other things to note here is behavioral health. We remain concerned it's not funded adequately. In the transportation area, there was a legislative audit at the end of fiscal 25 that found about $1.4 billion of costs that they were concerned had been charged to the federal government, but it wasn't clear we were going to receive the federal funds. The Department of Transportation is extremely optimistic that they're going to receive most, if not all, of that $1.4 billion, but there's certainly a risk that some of it doesn't materialize, and the Transportation Trust Fund has to absorb those costs, which are not built into the trust fund's spending plan. Last issue I want to mention, which kind of goes with the structural deficit challenge, is the Child Victims Act that was passed a few years back. And about 12,000 claims have been filed against the state under that act. The state law caps the liability for the state at $890,000 per claimant. So that's the maximum. But if you do that math, the total potential liability to the state comes close to $10 billion. There's no expectation that there's going to be a settlement during the session or in the near future, so that's not something that needs to be funded immediately. But it's something that the state will need to come up with a plan to pay for, again, in the next term. So that's on top of that structural deficit. It's a second kind of major fiscal challenge for the state. The last chart I want to talk about is just the Blueprint Fund and the outlook for implementation of the Blueprint. This graphic shows you the annual costs of implementing the Blueprint from fiscal 25 through 2031. And it shows how we pay for it. So the blue part of those stacked bars is the annual revenues that the Blueprint Fund receives, which are casino revenues, sports gaming revenues, a little bit of the sales tax. And you can see those are fairly steady throughout the time period. The green bars are spending from a fund balance in the Blueprint Fund. Back a few years ago when the state had really large surpluses, the General Assembly socked a lot of that money away into the Blueprint Fund to help pay for these implementation costs. And that has helped to cover the rest of those costs in fiscal 25 through this year's budget, through fiscal 27. But that fund balance is spent down almost entirely at the end of 27. There's a little more than $100 million left to help in 2028. So what happens is starting in 2028, you have to find some way to supplement the Blueprint Fund to continue to support the ongoing costs and the increased costs as we continue to roll the program out. That's the yellow bars, and that's the general fund absorbing that. And so when we talk about that substantial structural budget challenge in the out years, a big portion of it, about 3/4 of it, relates to this Blueprint cost and how the general fund has to start picking it up starting in fiscal 28, and those costs continue to grow through 2031. Madam Chair, that concludes my remarks. Happy to answer any questions if you have time.
Delegate Fisher.
Come on. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. David, didn't get a chance to ask any questions during caucus because of the time crunch, but can you tell me the AstraZeneca dollar amount that the taxpayers are spending is how much per annum?
It's about $14.5 million.
And that's for how many years?
8 years.
8 years. And is that in the form of a tax credit, or is that something else?
Just a direct subsidy to the company, just cash.
So it's a check.
Yes.
Okay, so it's okay. And then the other thing is, and I'm sure you didn't address it because maybe it's not known, but is there the potential of SNAP liability with the federal government from some of the things that we're reading but have not yet been told?
Well, so there's two known issues with the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So first, the One Big Beautiful Bill increased for all states the share of administrative costs that they have to pay from 50% to 75%. That kicks in this budget. There's actually about a 40 million general fund cost in this budget for having to pay that extra 25 percentage points of the cost. And again, like that impacts every state in the country equally. The other part is starting in fiscal 28, states will have to share in the costs of the benefits that are paid out in SNAP. Currently, the federal government pays 100% of the benefits throughout the country, but depending on what your error rate is, starting in fiscal 28, states will be asked to pay different percentages, anywhere from 5% of the cost to 15%. Maryland's a high error rate state, so right now we were in jeopardy of having to pay the 15% of the cost, which we're estimating in fiscal 28 would be about 183 million. That's for 3/4 of a year. In fiscal 29, it'd be about 250 million.
And is that a penalty that goes from the state to the feds, or just a reduction in funding from the feds?
You know, it's just we have to pay the 15% of the costs of the benefits that we're paying out.
I see. That's what I couldn't, okay, that's helpful, thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. Delegate Siliberti.
Chair, referencing page number 2. Spending reductions, that you have no appropriation to the rainy day fund, but 449.8 million. I don't understand that.
So statute requires that that we appropriate to the rainy day fund much of the surplus from the most recent fiscal year we closed. We closed fiscal 25 with a significant surplus. So by statute, 450 million needs to be put into the rainy day fund in fiscal 27. So you're supposed to put some of that surplus into the savings account, if you will. And what the governor is saying is, I've already got 2.2 billion in the savings account. I think that's an adequate amount of savings. Let's not put the money in the savings account. Let's use it to cover fiscal 27 costs.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Sample Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I always love when you come to the committees. I'm just enjoying all of the information. I'll ask the 2 questions based on our time frame that we have here. One, I wanted to get clarity on, and it's on page 2 and on page 24, regarding the cigarette restitution fund and the funds coming away from the settlement for HBCUs, but then going to Medicaid. That part I don't understand really. And then the other one, just inquiring on the school safety grants. Is that an increase, decrease, or where is that at this time? Just understanding that as well.
That's the easier one to answer. So it's $3 million for increase in school safety grants.
Okay.
On the HBCU grants, so I'll start with the good news. The good news is that the state is supposed to pay $60 million to the HBCUs as part of that settlement in fiscal 27. That is fully funded in the budget. The way the governor funded it is $35 million from tobacco settlement dollars and $25 million from general funds. What is odd, and there's a lot of machinations in the budget that you're referring to, is that by state law, some of the tobacco settlement money has been in litigation for many, many years. And by state law, if we are successful in winning litigation, that money goes into an account that is supposed to only be used to fund the HBCU settlement. The governor's budget assumes we are going to win and receive $70 million from the tobacco settlement litigation in fiscal 27. So normally that $70 million would go into the HBCU account, and 60 million of it would be used to fund the settlement amount for this year, and the other 10 would be saved to pay part of next year's cost. What the governor is doing is saying, let's use 35 million of it for the HBCU settlement and 35 million of it for Medicaid and other health costs. is legislation that allows him to do that. I think the reason that he's going through all this is because there's a little bit of uncertainty that we're going to actually receive more than 35 million. I think there's a little bit of optimism in the 70 million number, if you will. So I think, and I haven't been told this explicitly, but I think they didn't want to fund the HBCU settlement with money that might not materialize. So that's why he's using some general funds and some of the tobacco settlement money. But again, bottom line is that the HBCU settlement is fully funded with money that I think everybody's confident will be received.
Okay, all right, thank you for that explanation. And with the easy one that you said, the safety school grants, so that goes to MSDE, or does that go to a different commission? The reason I'm asking is because so many jurisdictions are very much, and rightfully so, concerned about ramping up some of the security, the metal detectors, the bulletproof glass, for the first floor of schools. And I was just curious of how that we can make this money work to begin some of those projects. So who has the oversight on that?
I'm forgetting the name of the entity. It's like the Maryland School Safety Center or something, which is budgeted in MSDE, but they're the ones who dole out that money to the local school systems.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely, thank you. Delegate Chisholm.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you again, David. And we've talked about Steve several times, but I wanted to ask you, we both agree that it was $1 billion a couple years ago, and now it's, according to the budget, it's going to go down to 163 million. I know in statute we do have in somewhere that X amount has to go to environmental. I think it's 20%, it might be 50%. Is that something that you guys look at, number one? And number two, and I can ask a follow-up once you answer, or I can ask both questions, you can answer both.
So there's two streams of revenue for the SEIF. There's the Reggie auctions, if you will, and state law has very specific targets for how that money gets used. Some of it gets used for energy assistance for low-income people.
Right.
Some gets used for various renewable type activities. And so those percentages are in statute, and the governor is complying with those percentages. The other revenue stream is the alternative compliance payments, which are more directive in how they're supposed to be used. And that's where the governor is essentially trying to expand the use of that money to cover a lot of different things.
Okay. And secondly, some of the latest OL reports came out, and one of them said, we could have as much as $888 million in potential unfunded liabilities and $67 million that they know of. Do you calculate that in when you're looking at the budget as could happen, couldn't happen, as you were just discussing with Delegate Sanford Hughes? We assume that you're going to win, or how do you take that into account to make sure that we don't get ourselves into trouble?
So there are many places in legislative audits that they've found concerns about, especially charging the federal government, not just in the transportation department. It adds up to billions. State budget assumes that ultimately we're going to get the paperwork to get all of that money. There's no assumption that we need to backfill that money. Periodically, there have been times where the state has conceded, yeah, we're never going to see this money, and you will see an appropriation in the budget to fix some shortfall. Usually that's more 30, 40, 50 million than billions of dollars.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely. Delegate Terraza.
I know, I should know this. After all this, I should know this. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for this briefing. I have every year appreciated your wonderful summaries of the budget and your insight, so I really appreciate that. Two questions. One, on page 2, you said something about an over allocation to the counties, maybe? Can you say some more about that? And did they receive it and it's being taken back, or it just was on paper?
Yeah, so there's something called the local income tax reserve account. So as I think you all know, the state collects the income tax both for the state and as well as for the county governments that you get income tax as well. And as that money comes in, the state makes an estimate of how much is related to local governments and how much is the state's money. And the local money goes into the local income tax reserve account, and over time it's doled out to the counties. in fiscal '25, they slightly overestimated the share that was the locals. So they put 150 million too much into the local account. So this is just correcting that and taking that 150 million and putting it into the state account. It does not, that money has not been sent out to any of the counties, so nobody is going to be surprised and find out
Okay.
they're getting
Great.
less than they were expecting.
Okay, and then the other question I had was about teacher retirement. You said that at least I wrote down something about this, 39 million being shifted to the counties. What percentages does that leave in each place? Because I know at some point it was all in the state, the teacher retirement, and then over the years it's been
Right, so
shifted.
yeah, to take a step back, so 15 years ago, the state paid all of the teacher retirement costs for everybody.
Right.
And then there was a change in state law where what's called the normal cost in the pension world was shifted to the counties. The normal cost is the value of the benefits the teachers will earn in the next year from working. So the school systems were on the hook for sort of those benefits. And the state was on the hook for the what's called the unfunded liability portion of costs of our investment returns don't always meet expectations, so then we have to make up that money over a period of time. What the state did last year and again this year is saying, we're not going to pay all of the unfunded liability costs. We're going to shift a little bit of it to the counties. Last year, we shifted $98 million, and that was a permanent shift. So the local governments are paying the normal costs plus $98 million. This year, we're saying, oh, let's give you another $39 million. So local governments will pay normal costs plus 98 plus 39. So it's just continuing to shift the share of the costs that local governments are paying.
So, but what percentage of the unfunded liability, though, does that leave with the state versus the counties?
Oh,
Do you know?
the state's paying like 95% of the unfunded liability
Okay.
still. It's just,
It's just
all
a
we're
large
shifting
chunk,
is the part of the growth, half of the growth
Okay.
in the state share.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and we will end with Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. David, it's good to see you in a different committee. I miss my budget friends, but I know we spend a lot of time together with the Office of Legislative Audits, and appreciate the work that you and your team do. And this document is always, I think, one of the most helpful that we get all year. I just wanted to make a couple of comments and then had a couple of questions. So appreciate my good friend from Southern Maryland on the SNAP piece, and maybe this is a isn't that so question, I'll phrase it, but a couple of things. Error rate also includes underpayments, correct?
Correct, it's over and underpayments.
And underpayments, okay. And the reconciliation bill from the federal government that led us to this position also has a pretty gigantic loophole that was literally designed for 2 specific states, but because of parliamentary procedures in the Senate, they had to apply it to everybody. That literally says if your error rate is over 30%, we're going to give you 5 years of a pass. Is that correct?
If your error rate is high enough, it's not even 30%, but if it's over a certain percentage, it's like if it's almost 14% or higher, you don't have to start paying for a couple of years. There's a delay. And when you have to start paying the benefit costs?
I'm pretty sure that was a way to entice several senators to get on board with the bill. And then it's also true that the error rate for the state was higher under the previous administration and has come down significantly under the current administration to where we are today.
So the SNAP error rate went up a lot during the COVID period. It was extremely high, and it has been steadily coming down. It's a little over 13% currently, but that is a big improvement from where it was just a few years ago.
Thank you. And then just on the OLA piece, I know obviously those audits are sort of one-time snapshots. I know we've spent a lot of time with the committee talking to MDOT and the State Highway Administration, and I think their numbers have come down significantly, and some of that overage was also, there's been a prioritization within MDOT to use state funds more strategically to try to bring in more federal dollars. Sometimes the process needs to catch up, but just for folks, the audit committee has done a lot of work on that. The 2 questions that I had for you just as related to this budget, I was wondering, I think particularly relevant to the committee on page 6, where you're talking about the discretionary enhancements. There's 2 items that the governor has added in that are new. There's the $5 million for repeat audit finding solutions, and then the $2 million for state fiscal leadership capacity. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's a really positive improvement for a lot of the issues that we're gonna see here in our committee.
Yes, so the 5 million for repeat audit findings, as many of you know, certainly you do, there's a number of agencies that have repeat audit findings. Many of them have many repeat audit findings each year. So this is kind of the first time we've seen any governor put money in the budget to try to deal with reducing the repeat audit findings. There's not a lot of detail on exactly how they're going to use this money. It's in the dedicated purpose account, so it can be spread out, but it sounds like it'll be for probably a combination of if an agency just needs more staff because they don't have enough staff to do some process, or if we need to bring a consultant in because one of the big agencies, Health or Human Services, just isn't properly figuring out how to charge things, and we need some outside help temporarily to kind of get a good process in place that then state employees can run with, that they could use it for that sort of thing. The other item for the fiscal leadership is we've had a lot of bad audit findings in some of our biggest agencies, whether it's health or human services or most recently in transportation. So I think this money is designed to try to make sure we can attract really highly qualified people to lead the fiscal offices to make sure that we have the skill sets in place. Because some of the agencies have had a lot of turnover in recent years and they don't have people who have much experience in the jobs they're in, or they may not be as qualified as we would like for the significant roles they play.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun or not, whether he's done it officially already or we'll be doing it later this afternoon, but I think the governor's going to sign a directive on some of the audit stuff too. And we've, I think, from at least the audit committee's perspective, we're really excited to see that in the budget. And I think the second floor and the governor's team have been really good partners with us to try to fix a lot of the issues that have been really longstanding. And then the last question, thank you for the indulgence, Madam Chair, is just on the COLA increases. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, it's my understanding that some of the bargaining units have different COLAs that are in the budget. And obviously that one just pertains to more of the sort of, I guess, the biggest unit that's asked me, but I was wondering if you could talk about some of the distinctions in the COLAs that are in more of the personnel line items.
So almost all state employees are going to get a 1.5% COLA. There are two notable exceptions. The employees at the school for the deaf are going to get 2%, and state law enforcement officers are going to get nothing, but what they bargained for instead was an employee increment, which is sort of a longevity increase in their salary, and that's what they chose to get that. Other employees are not getting that increment. So, and it usually equates to a little over 2%. So it's, certainly fairly comparable to what everyone else is getting.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely. Thank you. Delegate Crutchfield.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and I just have one question for you, and it's regarding page 8, the Therapeutic Treatment Center, and the fact that that's been deferred now. Just wondering where that funding will now go, now that that funding is available. Where is it being dispersed throughout the budget?
Right. So the state saves close to $300 million in fiscal 27 by delaying until fiscal 28 the construction of the Therapeutic Treatment Center in Baltimore City. So most of the money is used really in two areas. One is there was a grant to WMATA that's mandated. That was the governor's plan last session was we would pay for it with general funds, but it's capital related, so the governor is bonding that. So he's using some of that freed up capacity to pay the WMATA grant. And the other area is a number of natural resources, open space, bay restoration, a number of those kind of programs that we normally pay for their capital activities with cash. The governor's, again, bonding, is putting that into the general obligation bonds and sending the cash to the general fund. So it's really being used to provide budget relief by shifting things that are normally funded with cash to bonds.
Okay. And how much was that again, the total? 300, was it?
For the Therapeutic Treatment Center, the savings is like about $286 million in fiscal 27.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, thank you. And our real last question, from what I can see, is Delegate Siliberti.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, on page 2, under spending reductions, you note, let's see, you're going to divert, or somebody's going to divert, the cigarette restitution funds from the HBCUs. How do the HBCUs make that up?
As I was saying to the earlier question, so the governor put general funds in to fund part of the HBCU settlement. So he fully funds the HBCU settlement. It's just for the combination of general funds and tobacco settlement dollars. And he then uses some of the tobacco money for healthcare related costs.
But they're not going to lose that.
The HBCU settlement is fully funded, so they're not getting shorted.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you both so much, Mr. Romans and Ms. Risk, for being here and presenting to us today. And that concludes our briefing for today. We do have a bill hearing at 2 p.m. Thank you.